Well, we're going to get started again. First, I want to just thank our last panel for really doing a terrific job of setting up our conversations for the rest of the day through their really rich first conversation. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joyce Klein. I'm a member of the Economic Opportunities Program team. I direct our Business Ownership Initiative, which you might surmise from the name is part of our work, or houses the part of our work at the Economic Opportunities Program that focuses on expanding opportunity through business ownership. And as Dan and Maureen mentioned at the top of our program, the issue of inclusion is really critical to our work at EOP. It's critical to the work of many of our colleague policy programs at the Aspen Institute as well. And thinking about the work we do in business ownership, inclusion is very central to that. The work that we do works deeply with community-based lenders and other nonprofit organizations that work to provide information, access to capital, access to markets to entrepreneurs who are struggling to build businesses because they are not able to access sort of the traditional resources or source of support that are out there for entrepreneurs in our economy and in our communities. So the whole field of work that we do is really based on this issue of inclusion and how do we open opportunity, open resources to more folks. We do a lot of work with those organizations on the ground, and we also work with researchers and policymakers and donors and investors who support their work. And one of the reasons we have this focus on expanding economic opportunity through business ownership is we really believe that owning businesses is one of the key ways that people generate wealth in our economy. And so we say this issue of expanding business ownership is really critical to addressing the racial and gender wealth gaps that are such a problem in our economy right now. And so we've looked at that in our research and evaluation work and in some of the dialogues we have with donors and with policymakers. I'd also note that we've talked a lot in the last panel about issues of job quality, and this work on job quality really connects to the work that we do in entrepreneurship as well. We often see that an individual's opportunities and their experience with business ownership is directly connected to their experiences in the labor market. Often people build businesses around skills and connections that they build in their employment lives. And then they take that and translate that into their own business. And so to the extent that we have people in our communities, people who for reasons of race and gender are focused in one particular, only provided access to one particular part of the labor market, that shapes what they're able to do in terms of business ownership as well. So I think it's no surprise that we see, particularly among African American women, high levels of concentration in daycare and service businesses because that's where we've allowed Black women to work in our economy. And so there's a connection between what people are able to access in employment and what they're able to experience in terms of entrepreneurship. The other thing I would say is we also see that in larger firms that are partly or fully owned by employees, we often see higher levels of job quality. So there's a connection there between ownership and job quality. So our next conversation is going to go deeper into that issue of inclusion, and it's going to really focus on how the issues of race, place, and gender play a role in shaping who has access to opportunity and the quality of opportunity that they're able to access. And importantly, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we see in terms of race, place, and gender, but we're also going to talk hopefully about lift up some of the solutions and the work that folks are doing to try to address that. So our panelists have some really important perspectives and experiences to bring to that, and you can read more about them in the bios that we provided to you. But we have, first to my immediate right, Betsy Biemann, who's CEO of Coastal Enterprises in Maine. And then we have Gayatri Agnew, who's a senior director at Walmart.org. And then we have Gary Cunningham, who's the president and CEO of Prosperity Now. And our moderator is Tracy Jan from the Washington Post. So with a final reminder to, again, silence your cell phones, but please tweet using the Talk Opportunity hashtag. I'm going to turn it over to Tracy.
Thank you so much for being here today on a great fall Friday afternoon. So I write about the intersection of race and the economy at the Washington Post, and I'm very fortunate that I was able to launch this beat in December 2016 after the last campaign. I used to be a political reporter covered the last 2 presidential races for the Boston Globe, and now, race and the economy are always relevant, but especially today in our political discourse. I wanted to allow the panelists to talk a little bit more about their personal lives and how that brought their interest into the current work that they're doing with regards to inclusion and what inclusion actually means to them. So Gary, would you please start us off and discuss?
I'd be glad to. I'll tell you all my personal business. And so I actually grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I grew up in a very poor family. We were on welfare, and one of my vivid memories is seeing men come outside of our house to turn off our gas in the middle of the winter. And my mother had 4 children, and I remember being in front of a space heater where, and how many of you been to Minnesota? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about, middle of the winter, it gets pretty cold there. But I was fortunate that I had some adults in my life that really helped me transverse that the experience of being a low-income person to actually being someone that actually used my skills and talents and abilities to actually move to the next level. And it wasn't just because of me, it was because of people that came into my life. And I think we all have those people that have helped us get to the next level. But they also taught me that I had a responsibility and a duty to use whatever skills and talents and privilege that I have been able to get to enrich the lives and change the lives of others. I am dedicated. I have dedicated my life to changing the trajectory of this country, particularly for low-income and moderate-income people, so that we can all participate fully in our democracy. We can't all participate if we don't all have economic means to do so, that we can't participate in our financial and structures and systems. And so my background really speaks to who I am and what I am, and I made some determinations at an early age to do this work. So,
Gayatri?
Good afternoon, everyone. Tracy, I appreciate you starting off by asking us to share sort of a little bit of our stories. And given that all of you are inside on a sunny Friday afternoon talking about economic opportunity, I also want each of you, as we're sharing those, to think in the back of your mind about what yours is. Because every person in this room has a unique story that makes you motivated enough to work on this issue nationally, to sit here on a sunny Friday afternoon. So thank you all for being here as well. I was born and raised in East Palo Alto, California, which for those of you that know Silicon Valley is very other side of the tracks, quite literally other side of the tracks. And I was raised by a single mom who's a teacher. And it wasn't until I was in middle school that she got her teaching credential. And prior to that, she worked in early learning, and she worked for hourly wages, and she worked in inconsistent work. And when my mom got a full-time teaching job in middle school, it changed everything in my life and my sister's life. And when I say everything, I mean we stopped getting underwear for Christmas, right? Like it's a simple thing, but when you're living it and you're experiencing it, you don't realize that there's a future state that could be different than it. And so for me personally, having navigated through multiple different classes in the US as an individual, from a child to being in middle school to now working at the Fortune 1, having put myself through school after I dropped out and then going back to get my MBA while I worked full time, these issues are really personal. And I think to exactly Gary's point, this idea that Gayatri did this is just hogwash. I did this with the support of the community in which I was raised. We lived in public housing, and it was one of the only public-private partnerships in Palo Alto, California. And the day we moved into that house was the most important day in my life, because it changed that day and the day my mom got a full-time job are the two things that changed the trajectory of my life. Mm-hmm. And so I work at Walmart now. I've worked there for 5 years, and that entire time I've been working on creating pathways to economic opportunity for American workers who work at Walmart and who work in other places. I take the sort of personal philosophy that you need to make change from the outside, for that you need to both make change from the outside in, and you need to make change from the inside out. And so I'm sure there are those in this room who really gravitate toward making change from the outside in. I'm one that gravitated toward making change from the inside out, and we are both an important part of the change narrative.
Great. Betsy?
Good afternoon, everyone.
And thanks for pinch hitting.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I guess my story is really an intergenerational story, and perhaps one that was alluded to in the earlier session about the opportunity to over generations in the early part of the last century, perhaps being a little different than it is today. My mother's parents came to this country from Greece 99 years ago, and my grandfather worked in an eyeglass manufacturing plant in Western Massachusetts. And they had 9 children, all of whom either went to college, went into business, or went into the military. My father came here several decades later with $40 in his pocket, but with a PhD from a European university. And between my mother's side and my father's side of the family, they were able to create a good life for themselves and to put their kids through college. And really, what I've been doing most of my career is trying to make sure that everyone has that same opportunity. The challenge is that sort of Horatio Alger-ish story of they worked hard and they did it by themselves, I think covers up the kinds of systems, supports and investment that we've been talking about, and some of which has either eroded or is going away in today's economy. But at Coastal Enterprises, which we'll be talking about in a little bit, really what we've been trying to do for 41 years is help make the economy work well for everyone in Maine and more recently in rural regions around the country.
Great. Thank you all for that personal touch. It really people are able to connect to these issues because everyone has their own story, as you mentioned. I want to talk about the current state of inclusion in America. And Gary, you've described race as a wicked problem, one that you've written about how people's perceptions of it make it more difficult to address the root causes of inequality. Mm-hmm. And we know that the racist systems and structures at the foundation of our country continues to have a big influence today. How do you even begin discussing this complex topic that can be so sensitive, depending on the audience? Because we can't really fix what we don't openly talk about.
Thank you for the question. So where I'll start is we try to solve these issues using technical means. And these are not technical problems. They're actually issues of values that are underlying the dynamic that we have in this country where a large section of our population is asset poor and as well as income poor. And the fact is that there have been various attempts to try to create inclusion of everyone. So you look at the New Deal or the civil rights movement in this country. These were efforts to really transform America, but we haven't gotten there. And so I'm not hopeless, I'm hopeful. So when you think about solving complex adaptive problems, you really have to start looking at there's not one solution. There's not one fix. When we think about the issue of race, and that's where you started out first of all, if we continue down the path we are in terms of race, and Pew Charitable Trust came out with a report a few weeks ago that talked about the divergence of opinion between people of color and white people on this issue of race. And the gulf is wide, meaning black people have a total different view of where things sit than whites. And over the last 3 years, that gulf has actually increased and not decreased. So we've seen actually a shift in racial attitudes and racial thinking in our country about this. But I'll give you a metaphor. And the metaphor is what happened to the people on on Easter Island? So if people know what Easter Island is, it's an island in the Mediterranean. There were people on it. They lived there for many thousands of years, but they all went away. In part because they didn't see their own interests being eroded because they were using up their natural resources, right? And so the question of us being tied together in this mutual dance that we're in, that the more we can't see each other in the picture, the more we're going to end up like in Easter Island. And that's true with climate change, but it's also true in what happens in our country, given the demographic shifts that are happening right now in our country. And so part of what we need to be able to do is reframe the question, right? Reframe the how we talk about these issues. And this is a long-term strategy, but I've seen it happen. So if you look at gay marriage, when I grew up, I would have never thought that people that love each other of the same sex could get married, but we were able to transform our thinking about that because of personal relationships. So I think there is hope for us to change, but we actually have to define it so that whites see themselves in the picture and people of color also see themselves in the picture, and that we all actually belong together in this country and moving each other forward. And so I'll stop there.
No, thank you for that. I was just thinking about what you said on gay marriage. I remember in a couple years before it became legal for gays to marry, I was down in North Carolina writing about redistricting, and I met this pastor who was a big gay marriage equality rights activist. And she actually trying to prepare the South and the cultural fabric for the day that gay marriage would eventually become legal. They would organize these civil rights actions where they would get gay couples to go and ask for marriage licenses at the various courthouses. Right. So I went down with them in Mississippi, and people would just say the most horrible things as we're marching down the street. I was a reporter, I was following them. And I remember this one woman looked down and said her grandmother lived down the street, who she's no longer in touch with ever since her grandmother found out that she was gay, in love with a woman. And she was telling me these stories of her grandmother taking her shopping and blueberry festivals, and then now they're no longer in touch. And it was really sad. But we didn't know at the time that within 2 years that gay marriage would actually be legal, because the public opinion had already begun to shift nationally, and including in the South, because there were people who were gay everywhere.
Exactly. And so I actually think we can use, the best thing I ever did, I was a county administrator in a semi-rural, semi-urban place, and I was the only person of color, and I was the leader. And I could have come in there and said, well, we're going to do, you got to hire people of color, et cetera. The best thing I ever did, and this is the truth, is that I matched each of my leaders up with a person of color that was a graduate student out of the Humphreys Institute or school. And it was powerful, because when you have a personal relationship with somebody, when you're able to walk across and see the other person as a human being in the context of what we're doing, it actually changes hearts and minds. And so I know we have to work on the policy and we have to look on the political, but we also have to change people's hearts and minds about the other. And everybody has to see themselves in the circle of human concern, meaning everybody has to be in the circle. And so we've got so much hatred that's built up in our country around each other. And I could be just hating everybody given what's happened to my community and my people. But I actually choose, and all of us can decide to choose to actually redefine that.
And I wanted to talk about this in the sense of a broader diversity. We were talking earlier, Gayatri and Betsy, about misunderstanding between urban and rural, and how urban folks think rural is like all one thing. Gayatri, could you talk a little bit about the study that Walmart did and what you actually found in terms of?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to share a little bit about the America at Work report that we put out earlier this year. But before I do, one of the things I think, Gary, that you're commenting on, and Tracy, that you asked about, is history in the U.S. And I think when we talk about race in America, we often do it too much from the standpoint of today and not enough with an acknowledgement of the history. And it's very easy to feel like history is not a statement of fact the way it's sometimes shared here. And so I just wanted to share one of the things that's been personally really moving for me as being someone inside of corporate America trying to tackle these challenges was a choice that our company made to bring a training in called the Racial Equity Institute. And I don't know if any of you have had a chance to go through that, but there's an analogy they use in the training that we've now used with our corporate leaders that talks about groundwater, right? And so if you walked by a lake and you saw one fish floating in the lake, you'd go, oh, that poor fish. But if you walked by that same lake and you saw it was full of fish floating at the top, what would you ask about? The fish or the lake? And if you were asking about the lake, you would then start to ask about the groundwater. And America's history with race is the groundwater of the previous panel's conversation about why we face so many systemic challenges when it comes to these tough questions around economic opportunity. And so that's not a solution, it's just a statement of fact. But I think if we can start from there, it makes some of the conversations not easier to have, they're really hard to have, but it gives them context that we can share in versus all coming at it from a different standpoint. So the urban-rural question, so earlier this year, Walmart partnered with the McKinsey Global Institute. We have 4,700 stores across the United States, and we employ 1.2 million people. So when you think about the tapestry and the complexity of working Americans, and you think about the complexity of communities in America, Walmart is we're present in the vast majority of those communities. And we were seeing things that are a lot more complex than urban and rural. And we wanted to raise up that economic complexity because it's our nation's challenge today is to figure out how to make space to support and allow each of those different types of communities to thrive. And so we partnered to do this report that looked at the county level of analysis as sort of the micro level of analysis. So we looked across America's 3,000 counties and came up with 8 archetypes of economic regions. And we were looking in particular at variables that contribute to economic resiliency in that community, or said another way, as technology continues to change and automation continues to rise, which regions will be best able to navigate that transformation and that change. And what we found won't surprise anybody, right? It's more complicated than urban and rural. So a couple of examples of the archetypes, and you guys can find this online. Just Google America at Work, and you'll find it. Walmart probably put in there. Is an example of where I live in Bentonville, Arkansas, is a small independent economy. That means we're actually a very vibrant, dynamic economy, but not attached to a large metropolitan area. Another example was the urban core, as distinct from the urban periphery, right, or what we would commonly call the suburbs. But then you also had areas like North Dakota, which were resource-rich regions, strong, booming economies, but for a specific reason and a specific access to natural resource, right? One of my favorites, I feel I can say this while sitting on the stage at Aspen, was the Great Escapes. They were economically and statistically different than everywhere else. These were places like Nantucket or Aspen or Jackson Hole. But looking across the United States and actually seeing that complexity of our 3,000 counties, what you found is that you're going to see as much of Americana and distressed Americana in California as you are in Arkansas. Right? As it happens, you have a higher concentration of the archetype that we term distressed Americana in the American South. And that shouldn't surprise anyone in this room, but it's just a different lens through which to see the complexity of the economic issues in the U.S.
Could you briefly define what distressed Americana, the
Sure.
characteristics of that?
So I'm not going to dare attempt to recite the 60 different variables that we used. Again, it's all online. It is Friday afternoon and I'm tired, but it was really cool, right? It's a holistic analysis at things like level of education, wages, rise and fall of GDP in that market, inflow and outflow of population. And so we categorized distressed Americana as places where you're seeing a net decline and or outflow of all of those things. So things are going mostly just down. and not up. And that's not a judgment. It's attempting to be a little bit more of a statement of fact. And then we say, okay, then what become the unique needs of a community where capital is primarily flowing out? Well, it's for capital to flow in, right? And so that's not shocking information, but we don't treat communities necessarily differently based on their economic characteristics. And so what we were trying to say is the way to mitigate changes in technology and changes in the workforce today in a place like Benton, Arkansas, has got to look different than it will in a place like San Francisco, California. And again, that may sound obvious, but as you read the rhetoric on future of work, that complexity often gets lost, and you hear blanket statements about what's happening in America. But America is a collection of regional economies, and we have to look at the unique characteristics of each of those economies.
And Betsy, on that note, I was hoping you can talk about, in terms of outflow and rural communities, what the role of immigration is. And in Maine, there's a large refugee population as well. Given the political discourse vilifying immigration in some places, we can talk about who benefits from, who are the benefactors, or sorry, the beneficiaries of economic opportunity. Who is it for?
Well, for those of you who don't know much about Maine, we are half of the landmass of New England, and we're one of the last states to regain our sort of economic foothold after the Great Recession. Despite that, we have a lot of the variation that you just talked about in the sense that most of our growth has been in the South, in the greater Portland area, while our rim counties, as we call them, and more remote counties are still struggling. So with that comes, we are the oldest state in the nation. We are the whitest state in the nation. We have more people dying than being born. So without immigrants and refugees, our economy would be in worse shape, and they are definitely part of our future. We've had periods in the recent past when we had gubernatorial administration that frankly was not welcoming of people of different races, ethnicities, and particularly immigrants and refugees. Our organization, Coastal Enterprises, has worked with immigrant and refugee entrepreneurs for over 20 years, have worked with folks from 92 different countries, have helped 450 businesses be started by folks who have come, sort of like my grandparents and my dad came to this country, coming to Maine to start businesses. But like with women, like with people of color, immigrants and refugees have a harder time getting access to capital. They have additional barriers either of language or also just our way of doing things. We had Mariama Jallo came from the Gambia, and her family had always run stores, and so she thought she'd start a little grocery store and realized that there actually are quite a lot of immigrant-owned, refugee-owned grocery stores with carrying particularly culturally specified foods or products, and she realized, well, that doesn't make sense because that's sort of we have a lot of those, and that's sort of a crowded marketplace. So she decided she wanted to start a hair braiding and hair product salon with increasing numbers of immigrants and refugee women wanting particular hair products that just your more traditional Maine market didn't provide. And again, needing to have help getting in the Gambia, she could just open up the shop and get started. And here there were permits, there were licensing, and in fact, in the case of licensing, you need in this country you needed a special cosmetology license to start, because in traditional beauty care you are using chemicals or other things. But actually, in her particular case, she wasn't using chemicals, so we helped her actually change the regulation so that she didn't need to get a cosmetology license and could start her business. But it's folks who are starting all sorts of businesses, but as I said, sometimes due to language or lack of familiarity with our business laws and procedures, need particular help. So we created a Sharia-compliant loan product. If you are a practicing Muslim, you can't pay interest, and that's a big damper on getting capital in our system. But we created a product in conjunction with a professor of Islamic economics and folks from the business community. And so a lot of folks have been able to get access to capital to start their businesses through that vehicle.
That's great. I should do a story about that.
Right? That's happy to.
When you were talking about licensing, I was just thinking I just spent most of the summer writing about the licensing barriers for people with criminal records and talk about lack of inclusion of economic opportunity. A lot of these people have served their times no matter what their crime was for, but in many states, there are a lot of licenses that they can't get, licenses for jobs that have nothing to do with the crimes that they committed. So that's a conversation that's happening in the States now, and people are getting that changed. And I think I was focusing on Rhode Island as the main character because they have actually some of the strictest occupational licensing laws, but also were ahead of the curve in terms of sentencing reform.
Oh, great.
So, Gayatri, I wanted to ask you on the front line of retail is often women and minorities, and Walmart not being the largest employer, reflecting that same statistic. How do you, and the leadership in corporations are often not women and minorities. Is there a plan to change that? And how do you address that?
Well, I don't know if I address it all by myself, though if you ask anyone at Walmart, they tell you I'm certainly trying. So again, I really like to talk about the facts. And the fact is that there are more women of color working in retail, and they are on the front line. And the fact is that the leadership in retail, not just at Walmart, but across the entire sector, right? If you've run into a store manager at any of the retailers, odds are good, just statistically speaking, that it's likely to be a man and that it's likely to be a white man. And that's not a knock of any kind. It's just a statement of fact. So then you have to ask, why? What's going on? And I could tell you, except the previous panel outlined it so well for you, right? Like they gave you so many of the reasons why. And those are the systemic barriers for advancement, in particular, I think, for women. And so I work on the philanthropic side of Walmart. So I work for Walmart.org. And one of the things that we've worked really hard on over the last several years is to build a research agenda that helps us have a shared fact base to have and to start these challenging conversations. And so there's a report that we supported, which looked explicitly at the advancement of women from frontline retail jobs into leadership roles. And it looked at the 12 primary barriers that are created that make it harder for women to advance in those roles. And while none of the specific barriers would surprise you, right? When have we looked at in that way and asked those questions? And so, with that report, it was released earlier this year. It was released in spring. And one of the things I'm really proud of that happened with that report is our company and a whole host of other companies, retailers, grabbed that report and then they took those 12 things they could or should be doing and they started doing an inventory, right? And so part of this is it's very easy to be frustrated about the demographics or composition in the workforce today. I'm frustrated about it. I would like it to look different. But none of us can snap our fingers and make it different. And so how do we sort of get on that path to understand the complexity, and it is complex, to say there's one simple fix if we just fix scheduling, if we just fix childcare, if we just fix wage, if we just, it's all of it. It's all of it. And different retailers, different companies, due to different sort of mixes of their business, are going to be able to fix different pieces in different ways. But I'm assuming many of you saw the research that came out by McKinsey and Lean In last week. It's a beautiful piece about it that talked about women at the C-suite. And then it actually backed all the way up to sort of that, it showed this great bar chart, and it showed that the decline of women advancing actually happens at that very first rung. It's the first promotion for women. And if that first promotion doesn't occur, well, then we can all do math. And you get why when you get to the C-suite, you see fewer women involved. And they actually called it, I think, the first broken rung on the ladder, right? And so the report that we put out about advancing women in retail is one small contribution to trying to ask the question, what are the barriers? To then ask the next question, What are you, employer, Walmart, or anyone else doing about those barriers? And third, what can the community do to address those barriers, right? Because it is a collective action problem. It's not simply an employer problem to solve. But to me, I think it really starts with us getting more comfortable with the fact base around employment demographics. And candidly, there's a lot of risk in that. And I understand it, right? When you saw technology companies starting to be more proactive in the disclosure of composition of their workforce, you're starting to see a little bit more of that now. You're starting to see a shift in expectations by investors through sort of a lens of ESG investing about the kinds of questions they're asking and what sorts of disclosures they're looking for. Gayatri Agnew thinks that's a fantastic idea. I won't speak for my employer on how they feel about rising disclosures, but I think we've seen that when sort of the court of public opinion starts asking questions, it does force some answers, and those answers shine a spotlight on some of the barriers and challenges that do exist. So I just think we have to start with a fact base and keep asking questions.
Yeah. It's interesting because you were talking mainly about very large companies, and yet more than half or around half of all people in the United States are employed by small businesses. And unfortunately, they don't have research departments, and they don't even have, in most cases, HR departments. And one thing that we have found has been really helpful is to leverage our financing and business coaching relationship with small businesses, especially in a tight labor market. They need workers, and they're needing to be pushed. They're needing to go, and they're recognizing they need to go beyond their sort of typical way of hiring a new person, which is call cousin Larry and ask him if he knows somebody. And so we have been finding that actually there's quite a lot of interest on the part of business owners to do more, to do business differently. And again, even on the issue of immigrants and refugees, again, the larger companies have lawyers. They know what questions you can ask, what you can't ask. They know how to train their frontline supervisors, but these smaller entities don't. So we're actually having I think it's next week, we are doing a trainer of our business coaches so that they can be learning and then working with the businesses around these issues.
That's great.
So if I could, and all of that is great, and et cetera. As a African American person, when you look at the data, or I could be Native American, I could be Latino, et cetera, it will take us hundreds of years under our current structures and systems to get economic equality in this country. We do not have, my family and my generation don't have the time to wait and wait on the next report. I've been looking at reports for 30 years. How many of y'all been looking at reports for 30 years? Raise your hands. How many of you been looking at reports for 20 years? Raise your hand. How many of you been looking at reports for 10 years? So the question, we actually need what they call punctuated equilibrium. That's when there's disruption in the current system, because this, as someone said on the previous panel, we will continue, the system is operating perfectly well to get the results that we have today. It will continue to produce those results, and we will continue to see incremental change, and we will continue to see isolated communities, isolated individuals, segregated systems create the same kind of results that we have. So I would argue that we need to actually restructure how, or at least re-engineer, how our current economic system operates so that everybody can participate fully in our economy and in our system. And that means, and I'm not anti-capitalism. In fact, I'm very pro-capitalistic, but I am we're leaving genius on the table, as Van White says. I'm very much anti that the child on Pine Ridge Reservation will never have the same opportunity as other children in this country. So I actually think, not just to complain about it, but I do think there is a discussion going on at the Business Roundtable and other places that people are starting this, and in Europe and other places around world, that the current structure of wealth inequality will not change unless we do something very significantly different.
I feel like you were looking at me when you said capitalism. You like looked right over here. So let me, but no, let me strongly agree with you. And if we're going to go in that direction, let's go in that direction. So when Bernie Sanders visited Bentonville recently, he was, as you might be aware, down at our shareholders meeting this past June. And our CEO, I don't know how many of you know this, but stood up and called for an increase in the minimum wage. Walmart's CEO, just to be clear, that did happen. And part of that is because
Target did it? Oh, no, I'm sorry. No. Go ahead.
So actually, I think what happened in 2015 is Walmart raised wages, then Target raised wages.
Is that what happened?
I think that is what happened.
Okay.
Again, back to the facts.
Okay.
But I digress just slightly. No, I mean it's good.
And then Maine raised.
Maine
raised.
So look, like even Walmart CEO is saying to
LaPage.
Congress, federal minimum wage is too low and it's not working for working Americans. That ought to tell us that it is very, very broken, right? If that's what we're hearing. I also think you made the point about the BRT is saying this, and Gary's making a reference to the BRT recently putting out a really incredible news statement on the purpose of a corporation that dares to go so far as to suggest that corporations' sole existence isn't simply about shareholder value, but is actually about community building, about ensuring that individuals who work in the company, about communities that are served by the company, are also served by the way the company operates. And to that point, I could not agree
Do you think that'll make a difference?
I do. I genuinely do.
Right.
Well, the jury is out. I'll just say that on whether that's true or not, because what we're not seeing is the mechanism.
Right.
So you can say we want to do X, Y, and Z, but so there's
Laying
a
out the
difference between current state and future state, and then you got to have a strategy to get there. That's kind of what I'm not hearing, is what is that strategy, given on the other hand, the same corporations and others are going for no new taxes, tax benefits from the last tax, So you got two sides of the coin talking at the same. Our whole tax structure is upside down if we're going to get at what you're talking about.
Well, and I was going to say, I think wages are key, but so is health insurance, paid leave, knowing your schedule 2 weeks in advance so you can arrange your childcare.
That's right.
Having at least an annual review with your employer so you can say, how am I doing? Where could I go next? And having access to training. So there are all of those. And then frankly, if we did all of those things, we'd still be leaving rural communities behind because we don't have high-speed internet access in many rural communities. How will you keep young people there, attract young people back, or frankly have small companies that can thrive? We have thinking of one entrepreneur who literally, when he has a large file to communicate, to send to elsewhere, he gets in his car, he drives to the next town over, sits in the parking lot next to the library, and sends his file because his internet access is so spotty that if you're sending a large file, it stops in the middle, has to start all over, corrupts the data, et cetera. Wow. So childcare, access to childcare and access to the internet are two key resources that rural communities desperately need, in addition to the other things that we've been talking about today.
Yeah, and I was just in the Delta recently, and they don't have banking. Meaning, you go to the Delta in Mississippi, there's no banks. There's a credit union with one ATM. There's just no access to these things that we take for granted here in DC or in other places that folks don't have. And the poverty is so deep, throughout the Black Belt, not just in Jackson, and throughout the deepest poverty in our country is in Native nations across our country. So the question of, and why is that, right? One has to ask the question, well, why is that, right? Why have all the big banks left? Why isn't that somebody can get access to credit in these places? And part of it has to do with there's no money there, right? So if there's no money there, we don't have any responsibility for that, we leave. And so these folks in the rural areas and in isolated areas in our country, so you can be in Appalachia, so you can be in these places, that we need a system that actually, no matter where you're at, we all agree that we want everybody to have access to opportunity, and that opportunity has to be targeted in different ways depending on how people are connected to structures, right? And in order for us to do this well. And so part of this has to be about, if I'm a person in rural Appalachia, my results may be different, or my solutions may be different than somebody in Northwest DC. And so how do you do that? Well, part of it is you say, hey, if opportunity is on the third floor of a Walmart, and everybody has to get to the third floor, some people are going to take the escalator up to the third floor, Walmart to opportunity. Some people are going to take the stairs, right? There's people. But if you're in a wheelchair and you're not situated to that opportunity in the same way, you need an elevator. You don't hear anybody arguing about we shouldn't have elevators, right, for people that are disabled in our country. So we can actually do this. There's enough wealth in this country for us to actually create opportunity for all and create prosperity for now. But we actually have to step back and look at what are the systems that actually create wealth, and then how are those systems designed so that everybody participates. And that's really at Prosperity Now, what we've been working on for 40 years, is actually how do we make sure everybody can be a part of this system.
So that's great, leading to, before we get to questions, what is one key action that folks listening at home or at work, or our audience here who cares about leveling the playing field, what's one key thing that everyone can do? We could start with you, Betsy.
Well, I was going to say broadband and childcare. I already said
said
that.
it.
Yes. I guess I will say there is, CEI has been doing this work for over 40 years. There's a whole community of what are called community development financial institutions that are in urban, rural neighborhoods. And they really are channels for government, foundation, private, individual investment in these communities. And they typically they are sort of those communities. They have close and trusted relationships with organizations in those communities. And there are many ways that they can be, I think, used as an investment vehicle and as a sort of catalytic partner with folks in the communities we're talking about. So in a slightly self-serving way, since I already used up my other good ideas, I always say you can't build a movement behind an acronym. So I wouldn't say, CDFI would be on the banner, but looking for ways to invest in through trusted intermediary organizations in and with these communities.
Mm-hmm. Great. Gayatri? Mine would say that there's no backbenching or sidelines to the equity conversation in America. So what are you personally doing to be a part of it? And if what you're personally doing doesn't make you a little bit uncomfortable, maybe do a little bit more. So for me, that discomfort was moving from the Bay Area to Arkansas. And it's been a slightly bit uncomfortable every day since, but no, don't get me wrong. I actually really love living in Bentonville, Arkansas, which really surprised me as a biracial woman raised in the Bay Area, right? That was surprising for me, and it was uncomfortable for me. But I'm working through that, and you all in your daily lives have a chance to make yourselves slightly uncomfortable, especially here in DC. So I would encourage you to lean into some of those difficult or uncomfortable conversations.
So thank you for that. So I think that the thing that I've actually seen work, and my previous job, I was the CEO of an organization that worked with entrepreneurs. And what I actually seen work in terms of change of demographics is entrepreneurship. People of color, particularly, are the fastest growing entrepreneurs in this country. And they have the opportunity to actually address some of these underlying issues that are going on. Now, it's not the only solution, so there's multifaceted, but I would argue that we could have an economic revolution in this country by actually providing the access to capital. So the largest fund for people of color in the country right now is $16 million, is JP Morgan Chase fund out of Detroit. That's the largest fund in the country. Right now I'm working with a group of CDFIs on something called the Black Vision Fund, which is an $80 million fund to demonstrate, and all of these CDFIs, their loan loss is 0.87% over the last 3 years. This is better than most banks. Most banks are losing 5 to 6 to 7%. But we've figured out, we've cracked the code on how to lend to African Americans. So if we can actually grow that by 250% over the next several years, this fund, and grow lending and economic opportunity to community, we could create a renaissance in this country that would transform. Because, you know, at the end of the day, right, these demographics are shifting. If we don't do something now to address that, we're going to be at that Easter Island point I talked about earlier in my talk. That's where we're going to be. So investing in, and it's all the things that we talk about in a bipartisan way: hard work, dedication, doing what's necessary, hiring other people, being leaders in the community. We can actually transform the way we operate if we're willing to make the investment. But the market actually operates off of confidence. So you think it operates off of dollars and cents and that type of thing. But when you're making loans to people, you're really making it based on their confidence that you have that they will pay you back. Right? That's how the whole system operates. And if we can have some confidence in folks that have proven and demonstrated they know how to lend to Latino people and to African American people and to Native people, we can actually begin to change this. Because, you know, when people have resources in their pocket, if their families are fed, if they have stable housing, if they have savings and emergency savings, they actually do better. We know this. So it's not a mystery. So that's my one thing.
Oh, thanks a lot. This is a great conversation. I want to make sure the audience has time to ask all the great questions you have. Yes. You first. Okay. You first. And then
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this conversation, and I'm particularly appreciative of this notion that the circumstances and inequity we face is not a resource question or a technical solution question. It has almost as much to do with our moral inclinations. And so my question has to do actually with moral framings that accompany policy actions and others. I'm thinking of research in like behavioral economics on the interpersonal level, where there's indications that incentives can crowd out selfless behavior or pro-social behavior when it's not accompanied by a moral framing. And I'm wondering whether there's more that can be done in the area of discourse that speaks to the worthiness of certain places and whatever in terms of investment and the moral questions, the moral worth of our existing economic structures, like something that can accompany policy. And I think the shifts that like the Business Roundtable and where wealth resides is important, but there's a lot of skepticism there. So are there others that can be raising this? Are there other ways to contribute to this conversation? What's the role of media? Like, who else could be reframing how we do this, and what's the role of that moral framing? That's a question. Convoluted one, sorry.
Are we answering that or taking multiple questions?
Oh, you could take, two, and then we can.
Oh, this is a much more tactical question. The mayor of Topeka talked about the fact that they'd done some facilitation to help with transportation, the cost of transportation, and a few other things to make sure that people can actually get to work, right, and do it cost effectively, et cetera. And sorry for being pointed, but I'm wondering, because of the reach of Walmart, you know, how has Walmart actually worked with communities like this to ensure that people that are actually working in the stores have the ability to, you know, have that facilitation to just come to work because they don't have a car, or maybe they have a car but it's broken down. You know, what are the things Walmart's doing to invest in the community itself to you know, provide that? One last thing is, you talked about urban, basically not having grocery stores or banks, et cetera, in the Delta, we had a situation where we had I won't name names, but there was a large investment in Anacostia that just disappeared. And there are people in Anacostia that do not have a grocery store. They have to go to Maryland and Virginia, to do this. And so it was really challenging. And it was because of costs that entity just pulled out. So it's really difficult.
Wow.
Do you want to answer the Walmart question first?
Sure. Yeah. Sure.
Specific.
So it's a great question, and it's a question I've been asking since the day I got there. And I think one of the things that surprised me is actually how much we do on this, and how much we do on the ground at a hyper-local level. So there are specific bus stops in front of our stores that didn't exist before semi-obviously before our store got there, but we've had stores open for a decade and still no bus stop, and we'll work collaboratively with the local municipality to get a bus stop there, to put a bus stop there, which doesn't just help our associates, helps our customers, right? We want Walmarts to be a place that are accessible to folks. We've partnered with different workforce boards in different parts of the country. Part of the answer is it's going to be different everywhere, to work on rideshare systems. When bus systems don't run, we operate 24/7 in the majority of our locations. A lot of bus services don't operate 24/7. So I think there are a number of different creative solutions we've had in specific markets. We've had some interesting conversations more recently with some of the rideshare partners about what we could do to make it easier, to your point, just to make sure that our associates can get to work. So it's definitely, it's top of mind. There isn't a simple single solution, and I do think it depends on the community. But your question, if I could just jump in on that really quick and put Ms. Jane Oates on the spot, who's a couple chairs behind you. Well, you asked about what the role of the media is in this, and Jane works for Working Nation, who I think have done a really incredible job. I was telling her this yesterday, of telling the complexity of the story of the future of work and the role of companies in it, right? It's not happening to us. We are making decisions, all of us, on a daily basis in our consumer behavior, in where we want to purchase things, how we want to purchase things, how we behave as consumers, that are driving and informing a lot of the decisions companies are making that are resulting in a lot of the changing nature of work. But it's complex, and I was saying to her yesterday, it's not a headline, it's a podcast, right? You actually need the 30 minutes on it so you can dive into why is it so complicated, and what are the sort of what are the different variables, and how can we identify those levers and then sort of push and pull appropriately to try to get to that higher level of moral imperative, to understand that if there are no consumers, there are no companies.
Does anyone else want to tackle that question? Yes.
Yeah, I think it's a great. Both questions were great, and I think they're interlocking. Because if you're anybody and you're working, you have certain amount of your income that's used for different things. And if transportation is huge for you, or housing is huge for you, that means that you're taking money from other things. And the question becomes, what kind of place do we want to be? What kind of community do we want to be? And we get to decide that. That's a values question. It's not necessarily just an economic question. And then how do we ensure, given the vast amount of wealth that we have in this country, that everybody actually has access to not just income, but wealth, right? So these are different things, right? I would argue that there, again, no easy answers. And it's easy to make villains, right, out of corporate sector or others. I actually think that we need to come to some agreement that transportation is a basic issue that everybody has to have. And housing is a basic thing that everybody else has to have. You can walk outside here and there are people right on the streets in this place that don't have housing. They're living on the streets every day. Housing should be actually something that everybody has, right? But because of how we structured our society and our system, we're not taking care of those of the least of us. People with mental illness, people that have emergencies and fall down. So I would argue, and this might be a minority argument in this world, that we actually can change the conditions of that. We can maintain a system that actually benefits people based on their merit, but also a system that ensures that there's basic things that we have as a community, as a society, that we all have to give up something to make that happen. So that's what I believe.
Yes, sorry.
Well, a couple of thoughts just on the transportation piece. I moved to Maine 16 years ago from New York City, and one of my areas of culture shock was around the lack of public transportation. There are vast swaths of rural America where there is no public transportation, and the only way you get anywhere is in a car. So it's, as you say, solutions are going to have to be different in different places. And frankly, there are a lot of places in rural America where there are no grocery stores or there are no pharmacies. And so that means you have to drive long distances to get there. So definitely solutions need to be different. I guess I am both a pragmatist and an idealist in the sense that I do believe every morning we wake up and we can create the society we want to live in, and that there is opportunity for us to build political will to make these transformational changes that we were talking about earlier. In the meantime, I do believe, and I see it every day, that there are ways to align the, at least we see it every day, that we can work with business leaders, especially small business leaders who are very close to the communities where they live, and help them take steps that are good for their small business, that are good for the folks who work for them and with them, and that are good for their communities. And that there's a lot of progress we can make that takes advantage of that. So we don't need to wait for the amount of time it's going to take to build the political will and the social will to make the changes we all want to see. We can at the same time be crafting these sort of one-by-one solutions and using that to inform then the policy change that we need to push it to the next level.
Great. You?
Wow.
In this place, or woman over there? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm wondering if any of you have read Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. And since, Gary, you're from Minneapolis, which recently changed its zoning policies to eliminate a lot of the single-family zoning housing, which could be pointed to as, I think, a reason behind some of the discrimination in terms of racial discrimination in terms of neighborhoods. Do any of you have a view that changing zoning laws in certain places in America can deconstruct some of the themes that we're dealing with today? And is that enough? Is that represent the punctured equilibrium? And I love that phrase, by the way, that because it also makes people uncomfortable to change the zoning in the neighborhood that they bought in and live in, maybe have lived in for a long time. And is that a possible solution?
So I'll start off by saying I spent 8 years on the Metropolitan Council that actually defined the policies that you're talking about in Minneapolis. So I actually was much a part of that. And my wife was the mayor when all this was happening in Minneapolis. So I had a lot of I took a lot of rocks and a lot of intensity around the issues that you're talking about, because it is the region-wide plan that drives both zoning and economic development in that region. And now I'm here. But I can say that it's part of a solution. As I said, these are complex problems, and they take a multitude of various solutions. And so that's one of the solutions that will make a difference if we have more density. But I also think some of my more progressive liberal friends have used that as a catch-all thing that, and I think it's overhyped in some respects, as if it's the solution. So one of the biggest things that any of these places could do is unleash the capital that exists, so that people can actually utilize it to create jobs and economic opportunity. I think that also is part of the mix. So I don't think it's that one thing, but I think that's a big move given the amount of segregation that we've had in these communities, which isolates people from opportunities. So thank you for the question.
The woman in the jacket has a question.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I am an educational psychologist. I work in a nonprofit organization in Ann Arbor, Virginia, and I direct an early childhood program where we serve nearly 300 children, 300 families a year. We're also part of a more complex organization that was formed 52 years ago with the participation of about 26 churches that wanted to do good in their community. And what happened 52 years is that people knock doors and see, what can we do to make this world better? And they found that there were families who didn't have access to childcare, and that childcare opportunities were being limited for the working poor at that time, and that there was not inclusive programs available. Once they fundraise, they tried to put their children in programs, and those children were not accepted because they were of color. I right now serve 83% of my children come from poor, low-income families. 40% have special needs diagnosed, and about 80% come from immigrant families. So I'm right there with
Do you
them.
have a question? Oh, just in
Yes.
the interest of time.
The question that I have is that there is a lot of investment being made at the federal, local, and state levels to support these families, but it's not effective. And there's a lot of barriers in place. For example, childcare subsidies are available for these families, but only for families that have a specific schedule that matches the services that we provide. Is there something that we can do at the systems levels to, first of all, cross information and improve access? Because families have to bypass a lot of barriers to have access to funds that are already in existence. And the second question that I have is, how can we have more opportunities to bring to the table? Because I think, like with childcare and health and everything else, it cannot be a solution that comes from one place. Everybody needs to be on the table. So how can we have corporate America be part of the solution to what are the opportunities out there for corporate America to really hear what the needs are and be part of that solution?
Thanks. Gayatri, anyone want to take that?
Yes, corporate America would like to answer that question.
And here you are.
So it's interesting. I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I have reliable, affordable, high quality early learning care for them. And that has changed and will continue to change the course of my life. And there are many working moms, well, excuse me, all moms are working moms. There are many formerly working in careers moms.
Paid moms.
Paid moms. I don't have a good other term for that, who don't have that. And that's an injustice this country's got to power through. And it's probably one of the single greatest barriers, at least when it comes to advancement for women, that I've observed ever, right? So I don't know what we do about it. I personally, 2 years ago, founded a group at Walmart called Working Moms at Walmart. And one of the issues that we as a coalition of individual employees inside of the company have taken on is, how do we have tough conversations about access to early learning education, but also parental leave, right? So Walmart did change our parental leave policies recently, about 1.5 years ago, and we created equity between the frontline worker and the corporate worker. So if a store associate has a baby and goes out on leave, she's able to take advantage of the exact same benefits that I took advantage of when I had my daughter 3 years ago. And to me, that is an enormous step forward. Everyone should be doing that. The vast majority of retailers in America today don't do that. But if we can't even figure out how to allow a mom to be at home with her infant baby, I'm not sure where we are on the continuum of childcare in general. But I think it's a crisis. Gayatri Agnew thinks it's a crisis, and I am working inside of Walmart to try to change it. But I can't tell you yet Walmart thinks it's a crisis, because I don't think corporate America has been loud enough on the issue of access to childcare. I better stop talking before I get in trouble.
Let's take 2 more questions. You in the back, and then the woman in the front. Guy in the gray suit. Yeah.
Guy in the gray suit.
So I know we've been talking about how this is all of our problems, but the thing about this being all of our problems is that it could end up being none of our problems at the same time. I wonder, who do you think among government, corporations, nonprofits, and us as individuals should take the lead on solving some of the inequality issues that we've been talking about today, and why?
And then the woman in the front, we could ask your question too, and then we'll close out.
So for the third of Americans.
Yes.
For the third of Americans who are working in low-wage jobs, it's very hard to search for work at the local level. It's a cobweb, right? And so where are we in terms of wage transparency, so that the search for work can make clear from the start what the wage is, so that the job seeker can speed up their process and know what's worth spending time on?
Good question.
Both those are great questions. So the one is, who's on first and where do you start? The other is, if you're a person searching for economic opportunity, how would you do that in a market that is blind? If I'm paraphrasing your question. So I'm going to answer this by saying that there's been several points in this country where we've had great progress on issues that you're talking about. One of them was what they call the New Deal. Many of us wouldn't be in the room, or our forefathers, if there wasn't a New Deal, right? Meaning a New Deal for low and moderate income people in this country that created the middle class. And now we have a middle class that is shrinking. We have people that, we have an economy that actually has more jobs, more opportunities than people, if I could put it that way. But there is a mismatch of skills, of people having the ability to see what's in the market and be able to take advantage of those things. So both of those things are there. I don't think that we're going to be able to solve this issue until we have a new deal, right? So that is in part a government thing, but it's also part of a corporate and economic opportunity thing. So it has to be both of those working together to actually realize that we won't be able to maintain our quality of life in this country. We won't be able to compete nationally and internationally unless we change some of the basic things that are going on right now. And I think that's what the Business Roundtable is actually coming to the conclusion to. And this question of how do we create opportunity for all becomes critical. So that part of my answer to your question is, we need to actually shake this thing up in terms of how it's operating so that everybody can actually fully participate. And that means our tax structure, the tax structure drives wealth in this country. That has to change too. We actually have to have a tax structure that actually also rewards hard work, dedication at all levels of our society. And right now, that tax structure is geared towards, and that's why we have wealth inequality in this country, is the tax structure is structured the way it is. And if it's structured so that it rewards wealth only, then people at the bottom, people like that are sitting in this room, won't be able to take advantage of full opportunities in this country. So I'll stop there.
I think you're totally right about the structural question. If you think about the economic measures we love to go to most, we love to go to GDP growth, we love to go to unemployment numbers, right? Neither of those measures tell you about underemployment or economic mobility. And so until we as a country are able to look to and track those metrics, and there is tremendous progress being made on that. There are regional economies looking at metrics like that. There are states trying to look at metrics like that. So to answer the question of who's on first, us as individuals, American apathy will kill this country. So if you aren't taking it upon yourself for your personal mission to help create economic mobility in this nation, we're doing it wrong. Now, how you do that, through what vehicle you do that, right, depends on where you are and where you're positioned to have power and influence, and you've got to use it. So I happen to work at an employer, so I'll say it's the employers that need to go first and need to help to proactively redefine what the future contract looks like between employers and workers, and be willing to have tough conversations, because they are tough, right? And they're tough because no one wants to go first to say the thing that everybody knows, which is that economic mobility in this country is broken, right? Like that's reality. So let's talk about that, and then let's talk about what we can do to unlock some of that and to fix some of that. But I do think it is a true statement, employers can't fix it alone, right? As soon as you start to shift some of these systems, you're going to run into a need to modernize aspects of our current sort of labor market system and the laws and regulations around it. So I think it is an unfortunate both and, but I'll say employers need to help to start the movement, if you will, right? If you think about, and our planet Earth here is kind of dying, but we have been very proactive in some ways, right? And galvanized in how we purchase products and how we think about different companies through a lens of sustainability. I think we need to do the same thing through the lens of human capital and economic opportunity. We need to judge companies by whether or not they are helping or hurting when it comes to advancing economic opportunity in our country and around the world. And then to answer your transparency question about wage, I actually love this one, and I think technology is making things possible that weren't before. Glassdoor actually has a whole thing on wage, which is really cool. And Google Jobs, if you haven't seen this, has a beta where they're disclosing salary and wage. So I think it's possible, and I think part of it just comes back to that individual action demanded every single time. Why isn't that on here? Why isn't that transparent? Why aren't you showing me that? I think in a lot of instances, it's not been meant to be kept a secret. It's just a dynamic number. And so how do you disclose a dynamic number continuously? Well, through technology. So I think it's possible, but it's not prominent today, and I think we can change that by asking for it.
Betsy, do you have any closing words?
Yeah, I guess, I think we all have to do it. There's no one group that can, white people have to be there at the table. People of color have to be there. We all need to get a lot more comfortable about talking about earned and unearned advantage and disadvantage, and use that as a way of starting a conversation about how we can change structures in ways that improve equity across our society. And I guess, in a way, getting back to the very beginning of our conversation where we're talking about gay marriage, I actually think that the combination of sort of the speed with which that happened and young people in our country is what gives me hope. If you look at data around people wanting to align their purchasing power and their investment with their values, very different from baby boomers on average than millennials. And I think there's a lot of power in our young people about having and starting conversations differently, some over technology, some in the old-fashioned way of having conversations that young people in our society will bring to these issues. And I guess, again, being that mix of optimism and realism, I'm hopeful that that they'll help us to accelerate these conversations.
Way to give millennials a shout out and make
There
up
you
for
go.
that other panel. I'm not a millennial.
Well, I'd love to thank Tracy, our moderator, and our terrific panelists, and those of you who've asked questions. It's been a great conversation, and it tees up really nicely, I think, our next conversation, which is going to focus on and be on leveraging business choices. So we're going to take, I think, about a 10-minute break. And for those of you who are here in person, you can stretch your legs. There's some coffee and I think some snacks outside. So refresh yourself a little bit. For those of you online, thank you for being with us, and we'll start up again in about 10 minutes. Great.